Judge Dredd. An absolute comic book legend that has been going strong since 1977 and still has regular releases all the way to this day. A character and a franchise that must be said to have withstood the test of time beautifully, to the point that it has even received the most sincere of flattery: imitation. In the case of 40K's Adeptus Arbites, which we covered not that long ago, and so I feel honor bound to talk about Judge Dredd as well, because the universe has a fair bit of backstory, because, after all, how did the judges come about? Why is Judge Dredd such an absolute law-giving machine? And why is America divided into several mega-cities? Bearing in mind that Judge Dredd is set in future America. What could possibly have gone so wrong, or so very right, depending upon your perspective, as to see the entirety of the US judicial system be cast out and replaced with the Justice Department, which is now the sole real power in Judge Dredd's America? Well, the story starts with, as so many stories do, a scream. A relatively innocent one on this occasion, as it was that of a newborn baby boy. Well, two newborn babies, actually, but we won't worry over much about the other one for now. The one we are interested in was named Eustace. Eustace Fargo. He was born in 1999, although his date of birth would later be changed to 2001, to Father Nathan and Mother Mary Fargo. His father was a circuit court judge in Jacksonville, a small town in rural America. Eustace was an incredibly talented football player, the US hand-egg variant, mind you, but instead of becoming a professional sports ball athlete, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and graduated with a law degree from Harvard at the age of 20. Thereafter, he traveled to Washington, where he made a name for himself not in legal, but rather in political circles, as Eustace had ambitions far beyond the courtroom, as he was of the opinion that America had problems that could not be solved with a gavel and a robe. And there were those who tended to agree. Eustace was appointed government special prosecutor for street crimes in 2027, which might sound like a bit of a lowly position for a man with such a prodigious future. After all, what even is street crimes? Loitering? Jaywalking, throwing rubbish at the side of the road, some whoring and drug dealing here and there maybe. Well, there is that too, but by 2027, the average street in America was less Forrest Gump and more 2020 Kenosha. Actually, if you can even imagine it, the Judge Dredd future has even more controversial and energetic election seasons, as shortly after Eustace's appointment, bands of armed criminal gangers stormed the White House, successfully, with the president only barely escaping in a helicopter. Yeah. Interesting times in ye old US of A, and the new special prosecutor got right to work, cracking down on known criminal elements and forcing through countless arrests that had been held up in the judicial system for reasons of charitable donations. But even if the police force could be mobilized and made effective with relative ease, the judicial system that his father had worked his whole life in was far too cumbersome. By the time the wheels of justice had finally begun to turn, evidence would have disappeared, and witnesses too would have vanished without a trace, occasionally being discovered in local harbors or mysteriously stuffed into cans of cat food. Jurors would display a remarkable lack of civic virtue and rule against even those ironclad of the state's cases, and even the judges themselves, far too often in Fargo's view, prioritize their own comfort and need to not wake up with dismembered horses in their beds before the demands of the law. This was not going to work, and Eustace Fargo grew quite sick of their unreasonable behavior and the constant obstructions thrown in his way by a system so clogged with rust and garbage as to no longer be fit for purpose. Fargo presented a new idea, a radically different system, to then-President Gurney, with his plans for a complete revolution and restructuring of the American legal system, Fargo's New Deal. As mentioned, it would overhaul the Department of Justice from head to toe, but the single most drastic change would be in the judges themselves, which would no longer be old men in robes handing down verdicts after years of trial and deliberation, but young, energetic, and vital men with convictions, imbued with the power to dispense swift justice on the spot. Instant justice in the streets where the crime really took place. Not surprisingly, this was an unpopular measure amongst the elected officials of the time, who blocked Fargo's efforts to move forwards with the initiative. But a few more years of rampant street violence and outright warfare saw the citizenry align themselves in lockstep behind Fargo and the president, with a smashing electoral victory in 2028, which saw all opposition swept from the halls of power. Over the course of 2 years, new training centers were established, and all the remaining civic protections standing in the way of Fargo's visions were eradicated. Until in 2030, now Chief Judge Eustace Fargo rode out ahead of his new judges on their very first crime sweep. It was messy, but a mostly controlled demolition. There were a few stray rounds here and there, the odd collapsed building or two, and a few ill-informed executions. But the brutality of the crackdowns worked. Gang violence dropped significantly, as did the numbers of criminals, and so long as the streets were made at least safer, the general populace was more than happy to overlook the odd accident here and there. There were also some logistical issues as well. Despite their modern-day reputation, you see, judges don't just indiscriminately kill people. Indeed, Dredd himself is a perfect example of someone who will go out of their way to save lives where practicable. But the difference is that he and the other judges do not hesitate to use lethal force when required to do so by the law. Still, there were plenty of arrests as well, and with no silly little thing like due process to consider, the road from arrest to incarceration was usually only as long as the physical distance from crime scene to jail cell. And America was running out of jail cells at a frightening pace. They were going to need more cells. Hell, they were going to need more jails, as the prison population skyrocketed. More effective containment measures were obviously required, and once more, Eustace was there on the spot with a solution. With most civil liberties already rescinded, there was no reason why the prison population should live in such opulence as they had become accustomed to. No more mess halls or open-air recreation areas. No more recreation at all, in fact. Prisoners had a right to a bed, food, and a place to shit it back out again in, and that was about it. And you would be amazed how little space that actually requires. Thus, the first ISO-cube facilities were born. Enormous, near fully automated, self-maintained and standalone systems, capable of supporting a prison population in the millions. And it was considerably cheaper than the old system as well, even with its inflated size, as all the fluff and human care and comfort had been stripped out. And the prisoners weren't the only ones. The judges themselves, too, were a new breed as well. The very first of their numbers were, due to necessity, simple police and judges of remarkable caliber and integrity, retrained in the new system. But when time allowed for it, the training centers were replaced with academies of law, where recruits were selected at the age of 5 and then trained in the rigors of the law, combat, and the ethics code of the Chief Judge Eustace Fargo, which included such things as self-deprivation in all things. No alcohol, no tobacco, or narcotics, of course, but also no relationships, no sexual partners, and certainly no wives or husbands. The monastic code had been considered pretty extreme even amongst Fargo's most vehement supporters, but it was deemed necessary to create a judge whose sole love and dedication was to the law. No higher purpose could be considered, and no weakness inherent in having dependents and a family could be allowed. Fargo himself had a reputation for absolute moral perfection. He could not be bribed, he could not be threatened or shifted in any way. You could not use anyone or anything against him to move him away from his ideals of absolute justice. And this in turn became the foundation for the ever-increasing authority of his new Justice Department. Fargo would do no wrong was the chanted cry of the masses at every increase in authority, at every tightening of the rules. Fargo knew what needed to be done, and he never made a rule he himself couldn't live by. Or at least so they thought. But as with so many edifices, scrape off the plaster and you are likely to find a flawed interior. Fargo, despite his public persona, was not perfect. And it was eventually to be the oldest of all weaknesses that brought him low. A woman. Of course it would be a woman, with which he had an illicit affair. The oldest and most irresistible of all urges. It was at best an open secret amongst the top brass of the Justice Department, many who had undoubtedly indulged in the very same vice themselves, but all agreed that the symbol of the Chief Judge had to be protected and maintained at all costs. If the populace was ever to know that the Chief Justice was less than perfect, all the advances made up until this point were in danger of vanishing like so much smoke. So no one spoke of it where anyone might listen. It was a well-guarded, if, again, somewhat obvious secret. But someone, probably amongst their numbers, might have harbored ambitions of his own, as on one night in 2051, when the department was nearing the height of its power, 2 young street judges carried out a forced entry on an apartment where a woman was reported to have been screaming. Since it was a suspected murder attempt, the 2 made entry immediately and searched the domicile. There they found the Chief Judge in the bedroom in a compromising position. The avatar of all that was good and holy was not quite as sparkling as his reputation suggested, but whilst Fargo was in the end just a flawed man like everyone else, he still possessed his rigid sense of honor and duty. And so whilst the incident was hushed down by the powers that be, and the Chief Judge himself was assured that no one would ever hear of this, he still handed in his resignation to the president in person, citing personal and private reasons. However, when it became clear that his resignation would not be accepted by the president or the Justice Department, Chief Justice Eustace Fargo took the only honorable way out that was left open to him. He was replaced by Judge Solomon, who would finish a lengthy process started by Eustace Fargo. The final procedures required to see the old United States be dissolved in all matters besides foreign diplomacy and military. as internally all powers were divested into the 3 mega cities of America in 2052. Judge Solomon's reign would, however, be a relatively short one as Chief Justice of Megacity 1, replaced in 2057 by Clarence Goodman, who would oversee the Justice Department's biggest change since its implementation, the transition away from a mere police force, heavily armed though it might have been. It was still a simple tool of civil enforcement and obedience. But obedience to what? The state? The government? The United States of America? That barely existed anymore. If citizens had any duty now, it was simply to the law itself, and the law alone. Creating, in essence, the modern-day judges, who are not so much an arm of the state as they are the state, and all of its power in total, police, military, and emergency services all in one. Chief Judge Goodman also introduced a secret program that had been initially rejected by his predecessor Solomon, the cloning of the first Chief Judge, Eustace Fargo. There was plenty of genetic materials to be had, as Fargo, despite his best efforts, was still alive. The bullet had not killed him like he had wanted. He seemed destined to die on the operating table anyway, or very shortly thereafter in recovery, and so an elaborate cover-up operation had already been launched to ensure the continuation of his legacy. As far as the public knew, the chief judge had died saving a woman and her baby from a random drive-by shooting. But Fargo was as stubborn in near death as he was in life, and after extensive cutting-edge treatments, he had been returned from a coma and restored to relative lucidity. Far too late to call off the covering operations, and he certainly didn't have the mental faculties to do so, even if he had wished to, but he was alive. And, worse yet, he was not alive enough to recover. They couldn't simply call it a mistake and bring him back again. They couldn't hush it up or somehow delete all of the evidence that it ever happened, because he was slowly but surely deteriorating. He was lucid, he was capable of conversation, rudimentary though it might be, and slurred certainly, but he would eventually die, but painfully and tortuously slowly. 10 to 15 years was the prognosis. That was an awful long time to keep such a dirty, dirty secret, as the fact that the chief judge was still alive. And so, to maintain the secret, and also because they hoped to find a full cure and treatment for him, as Fargo was truly beloved by the Justice Department, his status as a living legend in the modern-day world of Judge Dredd is not at all a fabrication. He was seen as a true symbol, a saint of his time, and a justified revolutionary. If they could bring him back, they would. But there was no treatment at the time, and so he was cryogenically frozen. And his legacy entrusted to his 6 clones. They all entered the academy at the age of about 5 to 6 months, genetically enhanced to be 5 in body, mind you, in 2066. And amongst them, of course, was future Judge Joseph Dredd. All of the clones, Dredd included, had been implanted with false memories, and were not informed that they were clones, at least not yet. And that was probably for the better, as Dredd and his brothers were born in turbulent times. For despite the rip-roaring success of Eustace's system, now widely adopted across the world with new mega-cities popping up in all major nations and on all continents, this harmonious unity did not extend to foreign diplomacy, where the United States was busy throwing its weight around. For whilst everyone could agree that law law-abiding citizens were the only good and rightful thing to properly raise and nurture in a modern-day society, we still had a few arguments over resources to be resolved. And in 2068, America elected its last ever president, Robert L. Booth. Booth was possessed of a bright and sparkly personality and boundless optimism. Robert had come to the conclusion that it sure would be swell, you see, if all the nations of the world would just give America all of their stuff, their resources, their manufacturing capabilities, all of it. Like I said, optimistic. For reasons unknown and not specified in the source material, the rest of the world objected. Weird, I know. Very unreasonable. And President Booth, he thought so too. Tensions were quickly rising across the world as the age-old art of diplomatic threat-making inevitably had to make way to diplomatic bombings and aggressive forfeiture of assets. Sadly, the rest of the world still refused to see reason, and so, in 2070, the Great Atomic War began, as America started nuking, well, just about everybody. And everybody nuked America right on back. Now, President Booth wasn't a complete idiot. The US had spent a lot of time and money on a missile shield, which he had been assured would spare America the brunt of the chaos. And it did, with certain exceptions here and there. But it was very clear that his line of diplomatic reasoning had been less than ideal, and the casualty numbers across the globe would be grim. But no one really had the authority to step in and stop him. He was the president, after all, duly elected and all that. Or was he? The Justice Department had long been in opposition to the president's actions. But they had no legal power to intervene, unless a crime had been committed, of course. And during the nukings, evidence of just that emerged, as Howard Lint, senior aide to the president, confessed to the Justice Department that he believed the president had murdered several of his senior aides for the high crime of speaking up against him. And on top of that, he had never actually been elected, as Booth had stolen the election by tampering with the vote-counting machinery. Point of order here, by the way. I must make a brief break and state that I am talking about a fictional election in the Judge Dredd universe, YouTube. Nothing to do with any violations of the TOS. Paranoid, I know, but I have seen the YouTube bots triggered for less. Anywho, Lint could not prove the president's involvement in any of the murders, but he had a literal videotape of the election rigging part. Concrete evidence. But there was a problem. All the judges could really do here, legally speaking, was ask the president for his resignation, as his outright removal was only possible via impeachment. And that was an act of Congress, not the law. And seeing as America was at war right now, and with kiloton nukes dropping like fat raindrops from the sky, every megacity was essentially in a state of panic and civil upheaval, as the apocalypse was quite literally nigh. The prospects, therefore, of gathering up a congressional hearing on impeachment, well, it seemed slim. But there was one ace left to play. As mentioned, the cities were going crazy. The crime rates had stooped with the introduction of the justice system, but America was still a very far cry from a stable society at the best of times. And with the threat of thermonuclear annihilation hanging over everyone's heads, it is hardly surprising many went a bit stir-crazy and began looking for free shoes and household appliances, even if they had to break a window or two to get at them. The only ones who could restore order were the judges, and they were busy trying to do just so, but they had to deal with that president bastard as well before he could potentially retaliate, as the judges had already played their hand by asking him to retire. It was time to bring a certain judge out of retirement. Fargo was needed, his expertise and his wisdom. And so a pair of young judges, not even supposed to be on the street yet, as they had nowhere near completed their academy training, in fact, they were below the age of 14 at the time, were dispatched to collect Judge Fargo and bring him to the Great Hall of Justice. The two young rookie judges selected for the task were Judge Dredd and Rico Dredd. It seemed fitting, after all. The two young rookie judges successfully collected the old chief judge and brought him to his very important meeting, where he made it very clear that he was no longer chief judge, and he could not tell them what to do, but he could advise them. And there was, in fact, one legal way in which the Justice Department could get rid of a sitting president. The oldest law in the land, the Declaration of Independence. Along with the announcement that the Justice Department was deposing the president and seizing all powers that he had once held, the Justice Department also released the recording of him rigging the election, hoping that the public outcry would force him to resign. Booth elected a more confrontational strategy against both the Justice Department and the people. But gunning down a few protesters, of course, was not going to save his arse. The Justice Department needed dealing with quickly. The army was still under the president's control, although it had deteriorated somewhat over the years. It was still a formidable fighting force. And its first mission was the decapitation of the enemy's leadership via the assassination of Fargo. The assassination was carried out by large forces of the U.S. Army's airborne detachments, but was successfully thwarted by rookie recruits Rico and Joseph Dredd, which kept the chief judge safe for long enough for Justice Department armored columns to come to the rescue and escort him back to the most heavily secured areas under their control. The president's strongholds were overrun one after the other, until finally the White House was seized by a combined ground and aerial assault, with rookie judges Joseph Dredd and Rico Dredd taking part in the final action to finish the conflict. Mostly, anyways. The president fled, but he had lost all of his real power and was apprehended soon thereafter. Despite his crimes, however, he could not be executed. Or, more correctly, the chief judges did not wish to execute the last president of the United States, as they felt it would be a somewhat poor PR move. And I can see it. Instead, they judged him to 100 years of cryogenic freezing, after which he would be expelled into the wastes beyond the borders of Megacity 1. The judges had won a complete, crushing victory, and they had established themselves, their authority, and their power beyond any question and any challenge. From that day on, as they engaged in peace negotiations with the other mega-cities around the world, where judges swiftly moved to copy their American cousins' actions, the judges became the only authority on the planet. Megacity 1 would have its own little period of colonial ambitions, in fact, replicating perhaps the actions of its preceding nation, and would form alliances with Brit City and Euro City, and lasting hostility with the Sov cities, which would eventually come to quite the head. But that is a tale for another day. Judge Fargo remained active for quite some time, trying to guide the Justice Department that he had created. But he found that several aspects of it had grown more radical than he had perhaps hoped and dreamt of. Some conflicts came to an head, and there were even assassination attempts from within the department on Fargo. But he had seen far worse than that, and swiftly deposed of his more radical opposition. But he had, or so he felt at least, lost control of the soul of the Justice Department. As he went on and on, he began to worry that perhaps he had created a monster. As he asked himself the question as to whether or not the civilian population of the mega cities of America were still actually Americans at all, or if they had been replaced with the obedient, law-abiding servants of the megacities. The strain his doubt took on his mind placed an even greater burden on his body, and eventually Fargo was returned to suspended animation. The average citizenry and most of the judges were never informed that he had been operational again at all, and his tomb in the Justice Department remained with a fake body. One that was eventually to be replaced with the real deal many years later, after quite the series of events, as his cryogenically frozen form had been misappropriated. It had actually fallen into the hands of the very president that he helped depose, a president that would eventually be killed by a bunch of southern rednecks in the New Mutant Army. Well, killed by them whilst tied to the front of Judge Dredd's vehicle. It's a long story. Suffice to say, Fargo was eventually returned to Mega City 1, where he was briefly resuscitated, and his last words to Judge Dredd, his only clone son to be there at his side when he finally passed, was for now Judge Dredd to please rectify his mistakes, and that it was not too late yet. And ever since, always a loyal son, of course, Judge Dredd has been making a few moves here and there to not abolish, certainly not. Dredd still believes in the Justice Department. He still believes in the judges. He believes in what they are doing and that it is necessary, but he also agrees that there is a middle ground to be reached. How much of that is his own opinion, and how much of it is his genetics or his hero worship of the first chief judge, we can only speculate at. But Eustace Fargo's influence lives on even into the days of the modern Mega City 1. And whether or not it will be enough to change its future, well, that is yet another story for another day, is it not? For now, you've got a much better idea of the megacities and their history and how they were formed initially. Maybe we'll do more Judge Dredd lore in the future. We'll see as to the reception of this video and whether or not people would like to see more of it. Do let me know down in the comments section below, and until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.